let's look. This is a fairly new one, Onto Paris by Compass Games. I've had a stormy relationship with my Compass Games. I'd say I'd only had one that was a complete disappointment. But it kind of put me in a position where I'm a little bit less willing to buy from them than I am from, really GMT and the gamers side of MMP. But they're beginning to win me over in a number of ways. One is the subject matters that they're willing to touch. For example, this is Franco-Prussian War. But what really sold me on this one was that it's based on somewhere down there, the old Victory Games Civil War system. And it is very clearly based on it, but they've made some changes that I think are going to make this a much more difficult game to actually play. One of the great advantages of the old Victory Games game is once you kind of got understood the rules, other than the naval rules, everything went pretty simply. It flowed well. You didn't have to do a lot of lookups for anything. With this, I fear that's not going to be the case. And one of the big reasons, I haven't played it, this is a first look, one of the big reasons is here's all the different activities that you can generate, that you can choose to do with units. Now, the old Victory Games game had a very simple command expenditure system. Command points cost you initiative points, and we'll see how this works if you're not familiar with it when we go over the roles. They were the same value, so if you cost yourself a certain number of command points, it cost you the same amount of initiative points, and your leaders were basically what you paid. They had a value in initiative rating, which was how much you had to pay out of your, both command and initiative points to get things moving. Well, this system does something very different. It's very worried about the concept of coordinated movement, with armies beginning to appear like these little clouds. And in order to sustain that, which is clearly a level of realism that the Victory Games game doesn't really handle, it has a zone of influence for its armies, which this carries over, which is meant to represent that kind of cloud of activity. Well, no, instead this goes into details with coordinating movement of units, with units under command, corps under command of the army, and these corps might be either situated with the army or spread out outside of it. I suspect the main effect of this, because you're going to want to bring your armies together for major engagements, is because the designer chose to put a congestion movement effect into play. So you get a representation that's more accurate of what the army is actually doing in more detail than what you get in Civil War, but I don't know how much more correct it is. One thing that it did allow, though, is it allows for coordination between armies, which is something that wasn't too important in Civil War because, except in a couple of situations, generally the armies are going to be pretty far spread apart. You generally didn't have, historically, multiple armies operating in the same area, although there were certainly exceptions, and they tended not to successfully coordinate. Here, you just pay. You don't have any die rolls for coordination because the command structures are better than they are in the American Civil War. You don't have amateurs in command. Even the French, who have real problems with their command structure, generally have better leaders, but they're seeking effective leaders throughout the game. So it kind of does match with that leader system. And you'll have you have individual leaders in the game, but they're rated a little differently. And we'll get to the full introduction of the rules in a little bit. This is just what I want to approach here. You're tracking strength points of units, so individual corps have their own little tracks here with the strength points on them. The armies also have strength points tracked on them. But here's where we start getting where Compass's real weakness actually is. And it's in the presentation, the components, certain design decisions. So, in this case, okay, I don't know if these tracks are a bad idea or a good idea. They're interesting. But this weird blurred font, and yes, it's that blurry in reality, that ain't a good decision. Especially, I mean, here I have to be able to label the core and understand where they are. Here I have to read how many core are allowed in it, and I can barely read it. I mean, it's eye strain. Now, the Germans weren't as badly done, but, look, if you're going to play with weird fonts, make sure people get to see them. This has been a regular complaint I've had with them, is the information that they present on the counters is just not clear enough. Sometimes it's pretty, sometimes it's hideous. This is pretty hideous. But it's almost ineffectual in terms of conveying the information properly. Here's another example. These counters here, the information here on the bottom, the number of the core, etc., that's unreadable to the naked eye. I mean, I've got my reading glasses on, and I have to really come in about here, about 4 to 5 inches above the counter to be able to read it. Now, obviously, a lot of us are getting older. A lot of us have eye problems, and I never had eyes good enough to read, 2-point font from a couple of feet away, right? Normal games allow you to read the counters from a distance. Is that important? Yeah, it damn well is, because I have to know which unit it is to translate it over here, okay? That's already a mechanical difficulty, which you can say isn't too much bigger than counting a stack of units or whatever. So I'm willing to let that, the idea of translating it over to the sheets saves counters or something to stand as a reasonable design decision. But you damn well got to make the counters readable if they're going to, be translated. Likewise, different types of units in the game. So let's take a look at some of these. All right, so we got these number counters for infantry units. Okay, great. They look like nice counters. They got a simple number. No, it's not that simple. There's actually 3 different types of units for each army. So these guys, which look a little different, you can recognize the differences, but when you're sorting, when you're trying to play and handle other things, that's going to get in the way, and the Germans have the same kind of issue. These guys don't have a number on them. They're kind of special, but the German third type is just a nationality differential. Again, these are actually important factors. No attempt made to make that a little easier for the human to process easily, right? Likewise, the generals here, a lot of color on them. The name is important, written in really tiny font. These stars are important. They get blurred over by the flag implementation. Just not a lot of thought put into the design and layout. My friend Kyle has been doing videos on this as well, and he had a big complaint about using a general records track. I agree. My plan is to move all the nationality-based stuff onto the rail tracks because, honestly, I don't really need to know the rail information. But if you're familiar with the Victory Games game, it goes overboard on charts, okay, on different tracks to represent numbers. That makes play very easy, but it takes up a lot of the board space. And I can understand the decision to shrink that down. I don't really understand the decision that all of this stuff here, strength points for the different units, command points for the different command zones, all that's going to be tracked on one single general records track. Do you need to go as far as Victory Games did for it? Well, they thought you did because they're tracking so much information on the tracks and people weren't used to that. We're in a little different era now. Maybe people can handle tracks that handle multiple purposes, but certainly not everything on one track. especially when it's not even designed to hold everything. Even the map, now this is me, there's nothing functionally wrong with the map, okay? But it lacks some of the grace of the original of the VG game in that, you know, I like a lot of white space. That makes it easier on the eyes. It makes things rest better. All this color makes it tougher to concentrate on what's actually going on, what's important in the game. What's important in the game is not how much color is on the map and, you know, how that coordinates and whatever. No, what's important in the game is being able to focus on the pieces and what they're doing. And yes, the pieces don't get lost on the map particularly. There's fair choices in colors there. But there's a headache factor to looking at that much color, at least for me. Which, of course, applies also to the rulebook with all its color. But once again, that's really more a matter of personal taste. But honestly, the graphic design on the counters, trying to think if there's a single Compass game where the counter art was well done. Attractive Baby. Well done, never, I think. Maybe in No Peace Without Spain. No Peace Without Spain. Yeah, maybe the component art in that was good enough. But everything else I can think of, man, they really botched it. Okay. On top of that, you have a lot of charts and tables. Now, this is you know, you walk into this thinking, Victory Games, that was, you know, about the level of complexity I like in games. Great. You know, we'll go for that Civil War approach. That sounds fantastic. Now, I played the hell out of that game, Solitaire, just because the system and everything fit together and made for a very nice experience. I don't think that's going to come out of this. And one reason is looking at the number of charts. Now, that game had a fold-out player aid chart per player. Here, we've got this list of different action costs. You know, they used to fit on this much space or whatever. Now it's all of this. This command point table, okay, this is a track that I think was on, yeah, it was on the charts. So you're going to be rolling for the different, not theaters in this case, but sort of centers of gravity. Terrain cost, okay, we probably won't need to look at this too much once we start using it. It's not very complicated. It does take up a lot of space, but okay. But then we got to worry about the congestion. That's going to be something a little different, where it adds movement points depending on the number of units here. What is this? Zone of infantry ranges. Okay, zone of influence ranges. So everything in this game has a zone of influence. Back in the Victory Games game, it was just the big armies, which means you've got reactions possible all over the place. Now, these reactions are more limited. So cavalry has a 2-hex zone. Armies have a 2-hex zone. Now, that game had a 1-hex zone. 2-hex zone means we have to worry a lot more, and we're going to have to be focusing in on the map and thinking about how do we approach here, how do we get here. It's going to be much, much harder with 2 hexes of reaction space. Core have a 1-hex space, which is like armies. Now, what are core? Well, core are most of these pieces that are on the board. These leaders are not core. Those are infantry divisions. And there may be some cav divisions on the board too, but they're probably stacked in with the core. And other cav divisions will be actually on these army cards with the armies, as will be core. Normal strength points, without a leader, even whatever, they have a zone of influence of their own hex and can react in that case. This makes for a much more reactive game, and one in which it's going to be harder to play. The more interactive and reactive a game is, the harder it is to play in general. That tends to have advantages in an opposed play that don't really show up as much in solo play. One of the nice things about that game, it's soloed beautifully. This one, maybe not so much. It's hard to tell. What do we have inside here? Okay, we have a breakdown of the supply rolls. which we probably won't have to look at too much. The rules for extending your rail net. These are a little funky, but again, probably something we'll get used to. I'm just trying to see what the overhead is going to be on this, the burden, because that's the thing I'm most worried about. And I'm really, like, after reading the rules, I started saying, I don't know. This is seeming like a lot more effort than I was kind of looking forward to when I ordered it. And then when I set it up, man, did the headache start trying to read those counters and everything. Okay, a lot of the rules are embedded in the player aid chart. Now, the reason why this is, I'm saying, okay, well, we got 2 player aid cards per player, in the game. That's about the same. No, they're different player aid cards. Notice there was no combat chart in here. So instead of 2 copies of the same, we've got 2 different player aid charts that the players have to share. So there's a lot more information on here. So one thing is you're going to have an artillery fire phase. Artillery is taking a more important role at kind of a higher level than it would in the battlefield. It can't just be factored into the strength, but it is distilled from the strength of the combat units, which is spelled out here, where they have different factors for every type of piece in the game. Well, maybe not every, but like an army command itself has a 2-factor artillery attached to it. Each corps has its own artillery attached, but then the strength points that make up the corps have factors attached to it. Oh, boy. All right. Combat result table. This is going to be similar to the combat result table in the other game. I'm just trying to... Yeah, this is very similar to it. Where you come up with an odds, there might be a differential instead of odds if the rules on this are, I believe, mistaken. And then you translate to the size of the force that is doing the firing and determine what the effect is. And both players roll on this. What else do we have here? Okay. We have to worry about post-combat. What happens after the combat? Again, a level of detail that was abstracted away in the original, but now, instead of there just being, the damage results determine what happens, you got this other step where you get a little bit more, maybe storyline coming into it, but it adds more factors of some die rolling, some lookups, and everything like that to figure out what happened out of the battle. Not necessarily a bad thing, but again, not what I was kind of hoping for out of this. And then depending on what you get out of there, you roll on these charts to see what the effect is here on the defender, on the attacker, and then possible another chart which might be led into from the ones above for an actual failure to see how bad it is, what happens to you. We have siege rules in this one, which were not in, and which were kind of significantly missing in the Civil War game. But here, siege becomes a pretty damn important part. Cities are falling that were heavily, heavily fortified. So, and they were being starved out, etc. So we have to worry about that, especially since the Siege of Paris is sort of the culminating event of the whole campaign. And thus different kinds of fortifications in place that are on map. And then here we got some rules on the victory conditions. This is just some special rules. Again, that wonderful blurry font, so you can't tell what the hell you're looking at even easily. Sequence of play and then the combat sequence of play in here. So this could probably have been left out, although I like having a sequence of play. But yeah, there's or some of it could have been moved. There are basic rules or things that are included in there. Now, player aids are generally a good thing, but I'm just kind of looking at wow, they really kind of went overboard on information in the player aids. There's enough of it that it's probably going to cause an information overload, and they stop being as useful. We'll see once we get used to it, but once you start putting too much information in the player aids, it's hard to approach the game and hard to learn what all those player aids, where to find the stuff you really need in the player aid. All right, so Franco-Prussian War. And the designer pretty much probably reflects a lot of what we think when we walk into, considering the Franco-Prussian War. In part from wargaming, because wargaming generally just tends to cover that initial part, the first, couple months of the war, when it's actually it's not a huge war, but it lasted longer than is usually represented in the games. The games often cover just the breakthrough on the French, and then, well, who wants to handle a siege for the whole game? Yeah, but it's not just a siege, and that's what's kind of interesting here, is the French Republic, after Napoleon III's fall, puts up a fairly consistent fight to try to relieve Paris, both in the north and the south, focusing on a couple of things. One is attacking the actual Prussian forces that are besieging Paris. The other is trying to attack them indirectly by hitting their supply lines and trying to cause them problems there. I'm going to take a little bit of a break. My throat is killing me.